welcome to this episode of Geography Girl. Today we are covering a gigantic topic, and just to preface, I'm not even going to be able to scratch the surface of this, but I thought I'd take a look at the influence of the Soviet Union on the stands in Central Asia as a collective. This is a great topic because it beautifully combines Soviet Union planning with architecture of Islamic influences. You can see here there are very functional monolithic designs of Soviet architecture, decorated with patterns and mosaic motifs with Persian and Islamic influence. Some of it is beautiful, it's grandiose, some of it's a little bit strange, and also very deliberate in terms of using the built environment to influence the whims of the people. You know how I love to explore the influence of politics on the built environment, especially when two worlds collide, as they did in the case of Central Asia and the Soviet Union. Now let's go old school geography teacher for a moment and take a look at some quick facts about the region. The area we were looking at is Central Asia, which has a modern day population of 72 million across 5 countries. That's Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. They all have their own individual history, politics and cultural legacy, which deserve their own video individually, but we're not going to be able to cover that in this video. For the sake of simplicity, let's take the region as a whole. Bordering Russia, China and Iran, this region has historically been an important crossroads, cultures, trade and empires. There was the cultural influence of the Sasanian Empire in 224 to 651, the Islamic conquest of the 7th and 8th centuries, conquest by Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire, and of course being placed along the Silk Road, bringing extensive cultural, commercial and technological exchange between China and Central Asia. This also brought with it a spread of Buddhist communities, monasteries and art from India. Central Asia, before Soviet interference, had a diversity of cultures and languages, largely influenced by Islamic and Turkic civilizations. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries where the Russian Empire began to expand into the region. By the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet power was consolidated in Central Asia, with the Red Army defeating local resistance groups. The Basmichi movement, a nationalistic and Islamic resistance, opposed Bolshevik rule in Central Asia. This was a guerrilla movement that fought against Soviet forces, but was eventually suppressed by the early 1920s. In 1920, the Soviet government established the autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in Kazakhstan. The Soviet regime implemented policies of collectivization and sedentarization, forcibly settling nomadic Kazakhs into collective farms and state farms. These policies combined with famine and repression and loss of life. The Kazakh population suffered dramatically during the 1930s famine, known as the Golostyan genocide, which resulted in forced collectivization and grain requisitioning. The Soviet government conducted a process of national delimitation to create distinct Soviet socialist republics based on ethnic and linguistic lines. The process resulted in the establishment of the Uzbek SSR, Turkmen SSR, Tajik SSR, and Kyrgyz SSR alongside the Kazakh SSR. The Stalinist purges of the 1930s targeted local elites, intellectuals, and any perceived enemies of the state. This period saw widespread arrests, executions, and deportations. During World War II, Kazakhstan played a crucial role in the Soviet war effort, providing significant resources and manpower. The region also hosted evacuation industries and populations from parts of Europe. The 1950s brought Khrushchev's Virgin Lands campaign, which was launched to boost agricultural production. This campaign led to the settlement of millions of Russians, Ukrainians, and other ethnic groups in Kazakhstan, which altered the demographic and social landscape. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Central Asian republics became independent. It was a challenge for newly independent states to transition from Soviet governance. So let's get into the topic of the Soviet influence on urban planning. The main themes that run through the countries in terms of their urban planning is Russification, social realism, and collectivism. And we'll get into the specifics now. Russification. Urban planning often included elements of Russification, which is promoting the Russian language and culture alongside local traditions. As part of their propaganda efforts, the Russian language was used to permeate all areas of life in order to influence civilians. Russian was enforced as the main language in schools, higher education, media, and in literature and arts. There was an immigration of Russians, leading to significant changes to the demographic and ethnic mixing. Russian food and a way of dressing became the norm, as well as cultural practices such as public bathing and communal living. Social realism. Social realism basically describes how socialist ideals were to be communicated through architecture. It was characterised in art and architecture by mandating that an idealised representation of life under socialism can be communicated. Buildings and public spaces were designed to symbolise strength and the progress of the socialist state. There was aesthetic and ideological goals. The next is collectivism through communal living. The planning ideologies promoted collectivisation and communal living. This was reflected in the design of housing complexes that included communal courtyards, shared amenities, and spaces that encouraged social interaction. Particularly important in Kazakhstan, where 1.5 million lost their lives due to collectivization in the 1930s, which was one of the reasons for widespread famine and economic collapse in the country. And finally, adapting to market economies. Of course, a thing to note is that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the stands had to modernize their urban infrastructure and adapt to market economies. This means that there was a careful balance of wanting to preserve Soviet-era architectural heritage and wanting to accommodate urban development needs of today. This is manifested as the introduction of modern architecture styles, the development of new commercial centres, and the refurbishment of old Soviet buildings. Let's get into the common themes and challenges. The first is the legacy left by the Soviets. So looking at uniformity and planning, many cities in the stands still retain the Soviet-era grid layouts with wide streets and standardised apartment blocks. The city of Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan strongly reflects these features and has some pretty interesting looking buildings. There is a lot of brutalism, the State History Museum being a good example. This was formerly known as the Lenin Museum, and the structure was far from welcome when construction began. Many local architects and planners were opposed to placing a museum dedicated to the Russian revolutionary in the middle of the city, but after being accused of anti-communism, Moscow prevailed and started the project. There's also the circus. This was built in 1976. The Bishkek circus resembles a spaceship. Before Russian Revolution, acrobats, clowns and stuntmen were mostly performing for entertainment of the aristocracy, but after 1917, circuses were nationalised and made accessible to the general public. Following the teachings of Marx, the USSR was firm on the decision not to allow churches within its borders. So the wedding palace was built in 1987 to allow people to celebrate their weddings in grandiose style. The legacy of the Soviets is also in its green spaces. The city is known for its numerous parks, tree-lined avenues, and the legacy of Soviet-era planning. And infrastructure. Aging infrastructure from the Soviet period has required modernization to meet current needs. The city of Dushanbe has a lot of Soviet influence, like other capitals in the region. Dushanbe's layout and architecture are heavily influenced and somewhat hindered by Soviet planning. The city has undergone a systematic razing of Soviet buildings under an urban plan for a large and new city to be built in the south, which includes skyscrapers, a metro system, and elevated highways. This is reportedly popular with residents, with one stated that some buildings are so old that they cannot be repaired anymore. They have no historical value either, she says. It would be better if they were destroyed and a new, modern, beautiful building erected. The city should be refreshed. This has a tension with the need for modernisation and development. So, economic growth. Rapid economic development has led to significant urban expansion and the need for new infrastructure, housing and services. And sustainable development. The need to balance modernisation with sustainability, which is a key challenge, with initiatives focusing on green spaces, renewable energy and public transport. We can see this in Astana in Kazakhstan, who has faced the challenge of modernisation and is a prime example of Kazakhstan's ambitious urban planning. The city was transformed into a modern capital with futuristic architecture and infrastructure. Astana became the capital in 1997 and was redesigned by a world-famous Japanese architect. It is today compared with other planned capitals such as Canberra and Washington, D.C. This is a carefully manicured metropolis, which is reported to have a rather eerie vibe and a bit of a ghost land, despite having a population of 900,000. The city is dominated by a sense of order and decorated with Kazakh culture. Just look to the music hall. The buildings are incredibly impressive and are likely financed by the country's oil stock. And this, of course, has a tension with cultural preservation. So there are heritage sites. Preserving cultural and historical sites whilst accommodating urban growth is a priority, especially in cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. Urban planning in these ancient cities prioritizes the preservation of historical and cultural heritage, balancing it with the need for modern infrastructure. By enhancing urban infrastructure to support tourism, officials are hoping that the economic sector for tourism will grow. Some of the best examples we have of the Soviet influence in Central Asia and in its public services and housing. Just look at these typical Soviet Union housing blocks, beautifully embellished with Islamic and Persian artistry. There's also an emphasis on the provision of affordable housing, which for a growing urban population is a challenge. Environmental concerns do come into the mix. There is an emphasis on green spaces in Soviet Union planning, and a wish to continue to secure good air quality and incorporate climate resilience into development plans. In the city of Almaty in Kazakhstan, it is the former capital and the cultural and economic heart of the country. Urban planning here focuses on preserving green spaces and integrating modern amenities. The city faces challenges such as traffic congestion and air pollution. In 2022, the World Bank estimated that Kazakhstan would experience more than 10,000 annual premature deaths due to air pollution, an economic cost of more than 10.5 billion per year. To conclude, urban planning in the Stan is characterized by a mix of Soviet-era legacies, rapid modernization, and efforts to preserve cultural heritage. Each country faces unique challenges and opportunities as they strive to create sustainable, livable, economic, vibrant urban environments. The integration of modern infrastructure with historical preservation, alongside addressing environmental concerns, will be key to the future development of these Asian cities. That is it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.